My base case is the United States avoids a recession. It was really important to see the supply of workers coming back. We are close to, not quite there, but close to pre-pandemic levels. I mean, whether you want to call that a soft landing or, oh my gosh, we're finally out of this. So unemployment stays low, below 4%, close to 4%. That truly is the impossible being possible.
네, 2023 한국인이 가장 사랑하는 유튜브 채널로 선정되고 싶은, 그러나 아직 그 소식은 듣지 못한 글로벌머니토크입니다. 한국인이 사랑하지만 이제는 한국인이 굳이 사랑하지 않아 주더라도 그래도 세계 속으로 이제 계속 뻗어나갈 수 있는 이제 유명세를 확보한 글로벌머니토크이기도 하죠. 바로 소개해드린 그 글로벌머니토크 채널의 안방 마님이자 기둥이자 석가래이자 아무튼 그런 분을 소개하겠습니다.
늘 깔려있는 장판.
네, 중앙일보의 강남규 선임기자님 모셨습니다.
안녕하세요. 강남규입니다.
자, 오늘은 요즘 경제 이슈, 특히 거시경제 이슈 중에 가장 큰 것이 반년 전만 해도 미국 물가 언제 잡혀? 뭐 이런 거였습니다만 이제는 물가 잡으려고 저렇게 금리를 올려놨는데 침체가 혹시 오는 거 아니야? 이제 걱정하는 분들도 걱정이고, 요거 침체 좀 알아. 그래야 금리가 좀 내리지. 진짜 고금리 지겨워 하는 분들도 관심이고.
그렇죠.
특히 파월 의장이 나는 데이터 보고 데이터 디펜던트하게 드라이빙 하겠다고 했으니까 침체 신호가 좀 왔으면 좋겠다. 혹은 언제 올지 궁금하고 걱정이다. 이게 많은 분들의 이제 관심사인데, 오늘은 그래서 리세션 전문 이코노미스트를 저희가 모셨죠.
예, 그렇습니다.
네.
지금 전 페드 이코노미스트 클라우디아 샴 박사.
네.
우리 지금 어감상으로는 비슷합니다만은 SAHM 샴 쌍둥이라고 하는 그런 하고는 다르게
페드 연구원이면 우리나라로 치면 한국은행 조사국 팀장.
그렇죠. 팀장 그 안에서 이제 내부 팀장. 조사국장 정도는 아니었고 내부 팀장이었습니다. 우리 흔히 이제 최근에 2008년 금융위기 이후에 만들어진 여러 가지 그 지표들이 있거든요. 그 중에 하나에서 가장 이제 국내에도 많이 소개되기 시작을 한 샴 리세션 지표.
그런 룰이 있어요.
예, 침체 여부를 조기에 알아볼 수 있는 그런 지표를 만든 박사입니다.
그러니 이제 리세션과 침체에 대해서 오죽 잘 알고 있겠느냐.
그렇죠.
예.
그래서 오늘 그 샴 리세션 룰, 이게 샴 준칙이라고 이제 여기서는 쓰겠습니다. 룰이라 하니까 누군가 법칙이라고 얘기를 하는데.
그러니까요. 자기 이름을 딴 법칙을 만든 경제.
근데
학자군요.
그 법칙이라고 번역하기보다는 그 우리가 각도기 할 때 룰러 뭐 이런 표현을 쓰지 않습니까? 마찬가지로 뭔가를 기준을 제가 정해서 재보는 그런 기준. 실제로 지금 현재 고용시장이 어떻게 돌아가고 있는가에 대한 판단 기준. 그래서 준칙이라고 하겠습니다. 샴 준칙. 자, 샴 준칙의 개발자. 오케이.
네.
인터뷰 시작해 볼까요?
예, 현직으로는 샴 컨설팅의 창업자이고요. 그 전까지는 페드에서도 일하시고 뭐 브루킹스 연구소에서도 일하시는.
그렇죠.
네.
그다음에 그 여성 이코노미스트입니다.
네, 클라우디아 샴 전 페드 이코노미스트를 인터뷰하겠습니다.
샴 박사님 인터뷰 응해 주셔서 감사합니다. 사실은 제가 이런 어떤 법칙, 룰, 뭐 준칙 이런 것을 이런 개발자를 참 좋아합니다. 무수한 이코노미스트들이 있는데 이런 어떤 준칙을 자기 이름을 딴 준칙을 가지고 있는 사람이 드물죠. 오늘 인터뷰에 응해 주셔서 감사합니다. 특별히 감사드립니다. 그나저나 그 샴 준칙, 샴 룰 그것부터 좀 이게 무슨 의미인가요?
In 2019, I participated in a volume that was sponsored by two think tanks in the United States, and it was all about how can we create more automatic stabilizers. So policies that in a recession we could put on autopilot, tie them to economic conditions, get them going, then let Congress in the United States deal with whatever else is particular of that recession. My chapter was on stimulus payments. I had done a lot of research on them, a lot of policy work on them while at the Federal Reserve. I really felt like that's the best way to help households in a recession and get the recovery going. So my chapter was really about what's the research, why are stimulus checks good? Like, why would we want to do this? And then, well, if you're going to do it automatically, you got to have a trigger, right? So the SOM rule was just going in and saying, okay, a very good way, and it had to be simple because the idea is it would be in legislation, right? It had to be something we all look at and makes, is the reason we fight recessions. So going into the unemployment rate, looking at how relatively small changes can very accurately say that we're in a recession. And see, that's then the time to send out the checks. So to me, it was all about sending out the checks and why we should do this. And then it's like I created this recession indicator, which was later named after me. That's gotten a lot of attention. I'm happy that it's been able to be in this debate about are we in a recession or are we not? And yet it's been hard because as someone who developed the SOM rule, I very seldom get the questions of, well, if we are in a recession, what should we do? But whatever. I mean, like, I'm here to help. I don't get to control the dialogue, but it has been very interesting to me that it somehow became the leading actor in this discussion. I was like, no, the SOM rule was not supposed to be.
네, 제가 질문 좀 하나 드려보죠, 박사님. 이 샴 준칙이라고 하는 게 이제 그러니까 침체가 오면 재정 정책을 어떻게 쓸 거냐, 언제쯤 쓸 거냐 하는 결정을 하는 기준이라고 하면 저희가 배운 바에 따르면 통화 정책을 결정하는 기준으로 테일러 룰이라고 하는 게 있는데요. 둘 사이에는 어떤 상관관계나 연관성이 혹시 있겠습니까?
It's absolutely the case that the SOM rule that I developed is more focused on fiscal policy. The measure that I've developed is really focused on employment. So, and you have two different policies that we have in the U.S. to fight recessions or fight, imbalances in the economy. One is monetary policy, one is fiscal policy. As we have learned once again in this cycle, fiscal is stronger. And yet it's important to think about the monetary policy. One thing I'll say is that for both of the rules, whether it's the SOM rule or the Taylor rule, these are patterns in the past. The SOM rule has been very accurate in quote unquote calling early in a recession, saying we're in a recession. The Taylor rule, as it was initially developed, it was describing what have monetary policymakers done in the past. Well, the Taylor rule has now become very much like what's the optimal and what should policymakers do, and yet it started in patterns in the past. And the same with the SOM rule. It's, well, what should policymakers do in recessions? But it's really grounded in the past. And frankly, right now, we are not living in the past. So you have to be a little careful with the rules of economics because they're really just patterns. They're not like laws of nature. But but it's a very good insight in that these are, I mean, not only are they different rules, but at times they can be in conflict with each other.
본격적으로 저희가 궁금한 질문을 좀 던져보죠.
그렇죠. 이제 좀 운명의 순간이 다가왔습니다. 그걸 적용을 해서 현실을 좀 판단을 해보죠. 2023년 11월 고용지표가 이제 발표가 됐는데 그 지표의 근거에 의해서 지금 현재 미국 경제가 침체 문턱에 들어서고 있습니까? 아닙니까?
As you said, so the SOM rule, like to make it specific what we're doing here, it's taking the 3-month moving average of the national unemployment rate in the United States, and you take whatever that latest value is. So in the United States, we got the numbers for October recently. You take that 3-month moving average is 3.8%. The monthly number was 3.9. Okay, so you can see we're like smoothing it out. We get a little lower number. You compare it to the low of that 3-month average over the prior 12 months. And that was 3.5%. Now the monthly low was 3.4. Okay, so why do we do this averaging? It's because the unemployment rate bounces from month to month. And we don't want any policymaker, anyone to overreact to 1 month that's high or that's low. Okay, so the SOM rule, what it does, it looks at the 3-month moving averages. And if that difference between the recent value and the low over the prior 12 months, if it's a 0.5 percentage point or more, we're in the early months of a recession. right now is 0.3 of a percentage point, which is a lot closer to a 0.5 percentage point than it was this summer, where it was basically 0. But it's not at 0.5 percentage point. And in the past, if we look at it, this kind of 0.3 percentage point is very worrisome. Like there's no question about that. But if you look in the past, it doesn't always go into a recession. There are times where it rises like that and it falls back down. And as I've argued recently, there are many features of the current recovery in the United States that are very different, in that we could see the unemployment rate rise a little bit more, be around 4%. I mean, we're coming off a half-century low in unemployment rate, and it might just kind of hang at that level. And if the unemployment rate goes up in the United States to 4% and just basically stays there, that's not a recession.
2024년 미국의 연간 실업률 예측치가 4.2%예요. 그 정도 되더라도 그 샵룰에서 0.5% 포인트 이상 높아지는 상황은 오지 않을 수 있다.
예.
그런 것 같습니다.
박사님, 그 경기가 침체된 건지 아닌지에 대한 설명은 뭐 예를 들면 2분기 연속으로 뭐 경제 성장률이 내리막이라든가 뭐 다양한 뭐 조건과 기준들이 있던 걸로 저도 기억을 하고, 또 뭐 미국의 전미경제연구소 같은 기관에서도 경기 침체를 선언했다라는 뉴스를 가끔 들은 바가 있어서 그런 쪽에서도 경기 침체 여부를 판단하고 결정하고 발표하는 걸로 알고 있는데, 이게 샴준칙, 박사님이 만드신 샴준칙과는 또 어떤 연결고리가 혹시 있습니까?
The National Bureau of Economic Research, they have what's often referred to as a recession dating committee, decides what's the peak, so that time right before we go into recession, and the trough. So when do we like hit the bottom and start coming up? The committee, I mean, they're in the United States, they're the official decision makers about when the recession started and stopped. And the reason the SOM rule exists is that I want to be able to tell policymakers in real time, so as we go into recession, we're in one. Whereas the NBR, they look back, right? So with the 2008 recession in the United States, it took them a year, the NBR, to decide when was the start and the stop of the recession. Frankly, they decided when the recession had started after it had stopped, right? And so you can't, while they have a process, it's judgmental, but they look across a variety of conditions of the economy, whether it's the labor market, it's industrial production, it's personal income. Like they have a really wide range of way more information than the SOM rule. The SOM rule is just about the unemployment rate. So they take into a lot of information into account. It's a very knowledgeable group of economists, and yet they take their time. So a year into a recession is not soon enough for the federal government to send out relief, right? So I use their recession dates to test the SOM rule, like looking historically. Like I wanted it to trigger insight of times when they thought we were in a recession, and yet we couldn't write legislation on automatic stabilizers based on what they would later say. So the principle with the NBR that I mean absolutely makes a lot of sense is that a recession is a broad-based contraction in economic activity. It's when we go into recession, it's basically everywhere. And the unemployment rate happens to be a very good measure of, like, mass layoffs really pick up a lot of that contraction, just because in the United States, most consumers spend their paycheck, and consumers in the United States are 70% of the economy, right? So it's a good way to get at it, and yet the unemployment rate moves very slowly because it's like this feedback loop gets going. So the SOM rule and any other indicator used on the labor market is when things start to deteriorate just a little bit. and then they keep going. So it works well, but in no way, shape, or form is the MBR using the SOM rule to decide when a recession is. It's more the opposite. I use their what's a recession to kind of be like, okay, this is the right formula for it.
샴 박사님, 사실 뭐 그 최근에 글로벌머니토크에서 인터뷰한 아주 흥미로운 인터뷰한 이카노미스트 가운데는 폴 도노본이라는 사람이 있습니다. 스위스계 투자은행인 UBS의 자산운용 부문의 이카노미스트인데요. 그는 이른바 탐욕 인플레이션의 바탕이 되는 이윤 추구, 이윤발 인플레이션이라는 개념을 만들어서 최근에 관심을 모았던 사람입니다. 그 폴 도노번이 늘 경계하고 저에게도 사실은 경고를 했던 것 중에 하나가 이 실업률이라는 것, 고용지표라는 것이 자본시장, 그러니까 주가나 채권 가격 아주 민감하게 반응하는데 사실 그 데이터의 신뢰성을 따지고 보면 전부 다 설문조사를 한 것을 바탕으로 한다. 그래서 설문조사로 이루어진 고용 데이터의 자산 가격이 출렁거리는 이런 상황이 바람직한가에 대한 의문이 있다라고 한번 저에게 말을 했습니다. 어떻습니까? 미국의 고용 데이터, 샴 준칙의 기본이 되는 실업률이 신뢰할 만한 데이터인가요? 어떤가요?
The official statistics in the United States that we have, so those published by the government, that includes the surveys that cover unemployment. Those are the absolute best information that we have on what's going on in the U.S. economy. The response rate, so the willingness of people to participate, or even just the ability of us to reach people, it's diminished over time. And during COVID, it was particularly challenging for the government agencies to get out there and do the surveys. The government agencies have lots of checks on the quality of the data. Again, as best indications are, there's no problem with it. And yet we've had for almost 20 years now, people less and less willing to participate in survey. And so that's clearly a problem and not something one should be complacent about. So setting this like quality of the surveys aside, the piece that I think with the SOM rule could be a problem this time is that in the United States, we saw a big drop in labor force participation as soon as the survey began. And remember, unemployment rate is how many people are looking for jobs out of those who are in the labor force, right? So if you have a bunch of people drop out of the labor force in a very unusual way, it could kind of mess up this statistic, right? So when COVID came to the United States, we had people not just get unemployed, and there were millions of them within weeks. We had people just walk away. And one demographic group that, made a lot of sense was you had women, particularly those with children, the schools shut down. They left, they had to take care of their kids, take care of their family. And that, it's interesting, like that was clearly part of we were missing workers. In the US, we had, starting in 2021, these labor shortages because the customers came back a lot faster than the workers. So then businesses were looking for the workers. The unemployment rate moving into 2022 hit 50-year lows, right? And now in 2023, we've seen workers come back. And in some way come back really fast. Women's employment rates in the United States, prime age women, are at all-time highs. So you swung from like these huge drops in employment to these big swings up in employment. And so now we're in a position where the workers are coming back faster than the jobs. And that can lead to unemployment being higher. Because it takes time for these workers, and it's both the women coming back. We had a big surge in immigrant workers who had like work visas to be in the United States and had been processed. And so again, we just have this surge of workers looking for jobs. The jobs in the United States, the job creation is still really good, but it's not as like massively good as it was last year. So it's it's like timing. And so this is a case where these swings in the labor force can make the unemployment rate not as good of an indicator of where we are. But that doesn't mean that the data themselves are bad. It's just that like something like the SOM rule might not be reflecting, or it might, I mean, it's definitely reflecting things that are going on in the labor market. It's just, it might not be giving exactly the same signal of it's a recession flashing red versus, oh, we're just trying to sort things out.
네, 박사님 그러면 이런저런 기준을 놓고 판단을 할 때 미국이 아직은 침체는 아니다라고 판단하셨는데 앞으로는 그럼 침체에 빠질 가능성이 어느 정도 된다고 보십니까?
To start with, based on the SOM rule, we're not in a recession. We need not go into a recession. My base case, looking far beyond the SOM rule, but looking at what's happening in the economy, what's happening in inflation, what, you know, like just bigger picture, my base case is the United States avoids a recession. We are in a process of, and 2023 absolutely underscores this, we are in a process of rebalancing the economy. It's been extremely disruptive as soon as the pandemic showed up. It has been disruptive to the US economy. We saw in 2023, we saw a lot of the supply chain issues start to resolve. In 2023, so this year, we started to see a lot of the issues in the labor market resolve. It was really important to see the supply of workers coming back. Right. And so we're in this, and we've still seen really strong demand, although it started to slow some. In a lot of dimensions, we are close to, not quite there, but close to pre-pandemic levels. So the whole idea is to get on a glide path out of this. And the United States, frankly, relative to most of our peer countries, is much closer to managing that. I mean, whether you want to call that a soft landing or, oh my gosh, we're finally out of this, you know, like I don't know what the word is to attach to it. But my base case is that we get inflation down in the United States, get it back close to the 2% target, and we avoid a recession. So unemployment stays low, below 4%, close to 4%. And I mean, that truly is the impossible being possible. You know, because this shouldn't be happening, and yet COVID should not have happened, right? Like this whole episode has been unusual and very disruptive, and yet we're getting lots of sign of the disruptions, and that's not just in the United States. There's a lot of signs of the disruptions from COVID, very slowly, very painfully, but in fact working themselves out.
샤 목사님 지금 한국에서는 경기가 안 좋다고 사실은 아우성입니다. 그런데 미국 경제는 페드가 그렇게 긴축을 했는데도 침체에 빠지지 않을 가능성을 얘기하는 이코노미스트들이 많습니다. 왜 비결이 뭘까요?
There are two big pieces to this. The most important thing to think about that with consumers in the United States, and I mean this is not that different, right? But across the world, but you spend what you earn, or not even just what you earn, what you have, right? And so there's on the earn side, on terms of the paychecks, the labor market recovery in the United States has been great. Right. And it's not just unemployment is low, wage growth has been high, job conditions are better, job opportunity, people switch to better jobs. Like there's just across the board, this has been, unlike prior recessions, a workers' recovery. Right. Like they really held the upper hand. So you have people that have better paychecks. That's good. The other piece of it is we did see early in the recovery, both in the Trump administration and the Biden administration, some very big relief that went to households. We saw those 3 rounds of stimulus checks. For a family of 4 in the United States, those totaled almost 20% of median family income. And for, say, Black families, minority family, they were 25% of median family income. That's a lot of money, right? And so we had individuals both when they got the stimulus checks spending, but there's research, including my own, that shows that what a lot of people did with that is they saved it or they paid down debt. Like they did things that made their family finances better, right? Gave them something of a buffer. So then as inflation went higher, as interest rates went higher, they had some money in reserve. And so they were able to use that to help keep spending. And then paychecks were getting bigger, right? So these two pieces together were really, and then the United States, there were a lot of families, particularly higher income families, who their extra savings came from the fact that when we shut the US economy down, they couldn't go spend, right? So like, it's like the people who couldn't go on vacation, now they're going on vacation 3 times a year. So there were a lot of factors that just supported the American consumers up and down the income distribution. So not just the rich, but also those with lesser means to be able to keep going, paying the bills, in some cases going on the fun vacations that wouldn't necessarily have been able to or would have been discouraged from doing that if the fiscal stimulus hadn't happened, if the labor market recovery hadn't happened. You know, it gave them an opportunity to keep going. And frankly, the United States, if the consumer keeps going, we're going to keep going, right? That's just a big piece of the economy. It ties to the employment, and that's key because once you lose, if you lose the labor market, you lose the consumer, and then you're done. Because it's such an important piece. And that's why I look very closely at what's happening in the labor market because people need those paychecks and we've finally seen this, the paychecks they're getting ahead of inflation, right? And that in 2022, they were not, right? That was the period where people had to like really rely on some of that buffer.
네, 박사님 그렇다면 침체에 빠지지 않는다는 예측은 또 일견으로는 다행스럽지만 또 일견으로는 걱정되는 부분이 그렇다면 계속 물가가 더 올라가거나 인플레이션이 잦아들지 않을 가능성도 있어 보이는데 물가에 대한 전망은 어떻게 하십니까?
I expect that we will see, I mean, through the end of this year and then into next year, inflation continuing to move down towards 2%. And yet it is clear from 2023 that the trend is on our side, finally. We're working out a lot of the disruptions from COVID. I mean, this has not been a typical demand-driven inflation. This was an extremely disrupted global economy. There were a lot of bottlenecks in supply, not just with goods. I mean, supply chains get all this discussion and they were completely messed up. So, I mean, I don't want to downplay that. And yet it's also in most countries, we've seen some real disruptions in the labor markets. I mean, the supply of workers and demand and the mismatch in timing. And we're finally seeing those work themselves out. That has been a big, I mean, that's been the main reason inflation has come down is getting us back in some sense of balance. What happened in 2023 with inflation is what wasn't supposed to happen, right? Because we saw inflation start to move down notably. I mean, in the United States, we're talking about going from almost 10% inflation to, you know, a little under 4%. You know, I mean, like the inflation move has been huge. And that entire time we have kept unemployment below 4%. And consumer spending is growing at 3%, inflation adjusted, and GDP at this. I mean, these are just really big numbers. And so that tells you we didn't really have to destroy a lot of demand, which would be a typical macroeconomic conclusion looking at, you know, the high inflation we had. And we're not done with supply, right? We're still working out the labor issues. Wages have started to slow. That will decrease some of the input costs. We've seen consumers in the US becoming more price sensitive. And then, yeah, there have been demand interventions. The Fed has raised interest rates. Central banks across the world have raised interest rates, and the fiscal support that was there, it's not there anymore. So we have all the ingredients of continuing the downward march toward 2% inflation. And the most important thing is we got this help this year from the supply piece. Because if we had to do it all through demand, then it would be very hard to avoid a recession. The Federal Reserve, the central banks would have had to do a lot to get it back down. And so it's like, no, we're all rowing in the same direction here. The big danger in going into 2024 is if the central banks look at the situation and be like, oh, okay, we're on the right path, and so we can start to cut rates and ease off a little bit. Or if they keep their foot on, we need to bring down demand. So that's a tricky part of 2024. But frankly, I don't think the Fed matters as much as most people think it does. If we get to 2%, it's mainly going to be from the economy rebalancing.
샤운 박사님, 기자들의 악취미죠. 사실은 이코노미스트에게 예측을 끊임없이 강요합니다. 2024년 페드의 기준금리 어느 정도일 거라고 예상을 하시나요?
When I talk about what it should be, is I draw attention to the fact that, as we've said, inflation is coming down, and it in all likelihood is going to continue to come down next year. So when businesses or consumers make decisions, even if it's kind of implicitly, what's important is what's the interest rate taking inflation into account. So at this point, the discussion was, oh, does the Fed hold or they raise rates more? It's like, okay, they're not raising rates more. Like things have gotten better. Okay, but if the Federal Reserve were to hold its interest rate through next year, well, as inflation is coming down, that actually means this quote unquote real interest rate. So the inflation is going up. Like, so we could have the highest rates next year. Very bad. Like next year is not when we need the most like turning the screws on people. And yet I don't think that's there are some people on the Federal Reserve officials who see this. Like John Williams, who's the president of New York Fed, has been making noise about this, like, if inflation comes down. I don't think that's the general view on the committee. So I do think next year, as inflation comes down, they should be cutting pretty aggressively. So seeing something like 4%, not 5% at the end of next year. Now, do I think they will do that? No. I think that my base case, what's interesting right now is if you talk to or look at the forecasts across the different investment banks, I mean, they have really high-powered forecasting shops in the US. They are all over the map in terms of what the Fed will do next year. And to me, that says a lot of things and probably nothing good, in the sense that there's just complete uncertainty about what the Fed will do. I tend to be aligned with the investment banks who think it will be later in next year and probably not much. Like maybe at most a 0.5 percentage point, maybe a 1/4 percentage point. And largely because I don't think we go into a recession. I think growth looks pretty good. Not as good as this year, but it looks pretty good next year. Inflation is coming down, but it kind of slowly. So the Fed is going to want to wait until they are certain, because they're still skeptical. If growth is good, how exactly are we getting to 2%, right? This just doesn't fit the paradigm. And so I think they will wait. The most dire prediction I have is if the United States were to go into recession, and there are some people that are in this space still, 3 years in, still calling a recession, I don't think the Federal Reserve will cut. If inflation is still, like, they're not going to have to see it at 2% inflation, but they're going to need a lot to convince them it's moving there. And if we go into recession, it's going to be disappointing. They're not going to step in when they could. But again, I don't think, big picture, the Fed is not the only game in town here. And honestly, all of this hinges on how quickly can the U.S. economy, how quickly the global economy pull itself out of all these disruptions from COVID. And we don't need any other disruptions. Like, you know, we had COVID, we had Ukraine, we had like no more. We just need like things to calm down and let themselves work out. But honestly, we haven't had good luck on our side for a while now. So I'm optimistic, but only cautiously.
예, 박사님. 그 최근에는 샴 컨설팅이라고 하는 별도의 연구 컨설팅 업체를 운영하시던데 주로 어떤 일 하시는지 좀 간단히 설명과 소개를 해주시죠.
No, so I'm the founder of Sam Consulting, and what I do with the work that I do right now, it's varied. Much of the paid consulting I do is with investors or business groups that want to try and understand where is the economy going. In particular, what is the Federal Reserve likely to do? Having worked at the Federal Reserve for over a decade and being fascinated with monetary policy, that's an area where I have a lot of expertise. A lot of expertise as a macroeconomic forecaster. I also have had the privilege with the consulting I do to work with governments, both the United States and foreign governments. That obviously is not paid work. And I do a lot of work with media and outreach and with mentoring. So I have been very privileged in having the consulting work that I do and that I can work in a lot of different directions.
샴 박사님 인터뷰 응해주셔서 다시 한번 감사드리고요. 6개월이나 1년 뒤에 다시 제가 인터뷰를 요청하겠습니다. 그때는 오늘 예측한 것이 얼마나 맞았는지 점검하는 인터뷰가 될 겁니다.
자, 고맙습니다, 박사님.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I appreciate the invitation.
우리 샴 박사의 샴 준칙은 여기 샴 준칙을 간단하게 제가 정리해 드린다라면은 최근 3개월치 실업률 이동 평균, 무빙 에버리지라고 하죠. 영어로는 3개월치가 전 12개월 실업률 가운데 최저치보다 0.5% 포인트 높으면은 침체 문턱에 들어섰다라고 볼 수 있는 지표입니다.
실업률의 3개월 이평선이
예.
연저점 52주 신저가를 뚫고 올라가면 그렇게 되면 이제 침체 신호 반짝반짝 이거다.
참 존경스럽습니다.
알겠습니다. 예, 그거 뭐 저 익숙합니다. 주식시장에서 자주 보는 거라.
예.
네.
전미경제연구소 MBER 그
네.
비즈니스 사이클 커미티 경기판단위원회에서 결정한 보통 짧게는 6개월, 침체 들어간 지 6개월, 길게는 1년 정도 지난 다음에 뒷북처럼 그냥 판단하거든요.
지나고 나봐야 그
그렇죠.
분기나 그 반기의
그
경제
멤버들 보면
성장률을
저명한 경제학자들입니다. 글로벌
수 있으니까.
스탠다드로 봐도 그 학자들이 너무 신중한 나머지 뭐 산업 투자, 생산, 뭐 소비 모든 지표를 동원해 가지고 몇 년도 몇 월부터 경기가 하강하기 시작했다. 그다음에 언제부터 회복하기 시작했다.
근데 그게 항상 지나간 백미러로만 보인다는 거죠.
우리 흔히 하는 말로 뒷북이죠. 그러나 그 뒷북의 한계를 극복하기 위해서 만들어진 게 샴룰이다.
커런틀리 한 달 정도의 실업률만 있으면 알 수
그렇죠.
있으니까.
지금 아까도 이제 뭐 앞서 말씀드렸다시피 2024년 예측된 실업률이 4.2%. 이게 사실은 2026년까지 26년 예상치는 4.1%예요. 그렇다면 그 사이에 4.2에서 4.1로 다소 완화되는 거거든 실업률이요. 미국의 실업률 4%, 일반적으로 3%를 완전 고용 상태라고 보는데 거의 뭐 양호한 수준인 거죠.
그러하다.
예.
가끔 요즘에 왜 이렇게 그 고용이 뜨겁냐라는 다양한 분석 기사들이 있는데
그렇죠.
그 분석 기사를 보니까 아무튼 코로나 전후에 뭔가를 계기로 모멘텀으로 미국의 노동 공급이 줄었다. 뭐 조기 은퇴하는 분들도 생기고 내지는 다시 뭐 하우스와이프로 돌아가는 분들도 생기고 뭐 그런 다양한 뭐 외국인 노동자도 좀 줄어들고 어쨌든 노동 공급이 줄어서 뭔가 그 실업률이 낮게 나타나고 고용이 타이트하게 나타나는 것은
예.
실제로 경기가 뜨거워서가 아니라 경기는 예전보다 식었을 수도 있고 뭐 비슷할 수도 있는데
그럴 수도 있죠.
노동 공급 자체가 줄어서 생긴 노동력 수요 초과 현상.
그렇죠.
그것도 그럼 그거는 경기 좋은 거다. 이미 생산 활동에서는 리세션이 생기고 있음에도 불구하고 노동력만 쇼티지가 나고 있는 수도 있는데
그렇죠.
그것도 리세션 아니라고 볼 수 있는 겁니까?
아주 사실 저도 개인적으로 그 문제에 대해서 많은 이코노미스트들에게 물어볼 수밖에 없었던 핫 이슈죠, 사실은. 근데 대체적으로 이런 얘기를 합니다. 그러니까 우리가 이제 한 나라, 그러니까 특히 미국 같은 경우 고용 지표를 굉장히 침체 여부를 판단할 때 기준으로 삼는 이유가 뭐냐면 미국 경제의 주요 성장 엔진이 소비이기 때문에
네.
그 소비가 줄어들지 않는다는 거죠. 실업률이 낮으면은.
예.
그렇다라면은 소비가 줄어들지 않는다라면은 투자와 그러니까 흔히 말하는 비즈니스 익스펜디처, 투자와 기타 이 집값이라든지 자산 가격이라든지
괜찮을 거다.
괜찮을 것이다.
소비 지표도 같이 본다는 거겠죠, 그죠?
그렇죠.
소비나 혹은 뭐 소매 판매나.
네.
그러니까 뭐 예를 들면 아주 극단적으로 말도 안 되는 시나리오입니다만 어느 날 뭔가 뭐 질병이 나타나서 혹은 뭐 뭔가 폭격으로 인해서 사고로 인해서 미국인 인구의 한 절반 정도가 만약에 사라지면 어느 날 갑자기 그럼 일손이 모자라니까 수출용 공장은 돌려야 되고 그럼 당연히 일손은 모자랄 텐데 만들어내는 생산량이나 소비량은 확 줄었을 거 아니겠어요?
그렇죠.
그러면 이거를 리세션으로 봐야 되는 거 아니냐 이제 하는 거죠. 항상 일상적이라면 실업률이 좋은 지표가 될 수 있으나 코로나 이후로 이 노동력의 수요 공급이 뒤틀려 있는 상태라면
그게 이제 양적 접근인데
네.
이 일반적으로 침체를 정의를 할 때에 뭐라 그러냐면은 균형이 깨진 걸 침체라고 얘기를 하거든요. 총 생산 못지않게 소비가 깨졌을 때, 이른바 과소 소비설.
예.
이제 물론 공황을 설명할 때도 그렇게 얘기를 하는데 한 나라의 경제가 뭔가 밸런스가 깨지는 바람에 생산 부문과 소비 부문, 그 다음에 기타 다양한 부문 간의 균형이 깨졌을 때에.
네.
사실은 우리가 침체한다고 해서 총 생산량이 줄어들어서 이 어떤 공급이 줄어서 품귀 현상은 안 나타나지 않습니까?
예.
구매력이 떨어지는 경우가 많잖아요. 그런 측면으로 그런 말로 그런 시각에서 다시 한번 살펴봐야 될 것 같아요.
오로지 실업률만 보는 건 아니지만 소비
총
지표나
생산량 현대 자본주의에서 총
알겠습니다.
생산량이 줄어서 품귀 현상이 나는 경우는 거의 없습니다. 단지 그것을 얼마나 유통해서 소비해서 공급자가 현금화해서 이윤과 함께 할 수 있는가, 현금화할 수 있는가, 그
알겠습니다.
부분이 제대로 돌아가지 않아서.
예. 자, 저희는 또 그러면 다음 인터뷰 주인공을 찾아서 떠나야 할 텐데.
마틴 울프를 서울에 올 기회에 단독으로 이제 스튜디오로 불러서 인터뷰할 수 있는 기회를 마련하자 그러니까.
예. 마틴 울프 그분 또 왔어요?
그분 온다 그러길래.
한국에.
그래서 이제 북토크라 그러죠.
예.
저서에 관한 심층적인 얘기와 함께 내년도에 미국과 중국, 유럽 경제 진단까지 같이
그렇죠.
하기로 했습니다.
네, 어느 때야말로 궁금한.
그렇죠.
미국도 궁금하고,
중국도 궁금하고,
또 중국도 진짜 궁금하고 우리에게 더 영향을 많이 끼치니까. 또 유럽도 궁금하고.
그렇죠.
제일 먼저 침체에 빠져서 기준금리를 내리는 신호를 그쪽에서 보내지 않을까 걱정스럽기도 하고. 또 독일의 침체가 어느 정도 진행될지도 궁금하고 하여튼 요즘은 궁금한 게 참 많습니다.
예.
마틴 울프의 인터뷰가 준비되어 있군요. 그럼 저희는 한 주 쉬는 거네요?
둘이 만나는 걸 한 주 쉬고.
알겠습니다.
예. Have a nice day.
나이스 위크엔드.
Have a break. Nice break.
네. 자, 글로벌 머니토크. 그럼 한 주는 저희 쉬었다가 여러분들은 쉬는 거 아니에요? 마틴 울프 인터뷰를 또 한 주일 후에 또 보내드릴 거니까요. 자, 여러분들 또 연말에 뵙겠습니다. 고맙습니다.
감사합니다.